In just 3 minutes, $2.1 billion didn't vanish. It was bled dry, signed off by a trembling, whiskey-soaked hand at Mar-a-Lago. Pete Hegseth, 3 drinks in, took a slurred command from Trump and greenlit a deal that left wounded soldiers waiting while defense contractors cashed in. Then came Jasmine Crockett, silent, steady, and surgical, dropping a single USB that didn't just expose him. It blew the lid off everything. If a drunken nod can move billions, what secrets have already been sold under our name? The red tally light on the C-SPAN camera blinked once, then locked on. Live, no edits, no do-overs. The national oversight hearing had just begun, and already the air inside the chamber felt like a loaded gun waiting for a finger. Behind the mahogany benches, staffers shuffled notes, eyes darting toward the hearing door. Whispers moved like static. Something big was about to break. Everyone felt it, even those pretending not to. Then came the sound of heels measured, deliberate, unhurried. Jasmine Crockett entered the chamber, not as a guest, not as a firebrand, but as a storm in a tailored navy blue suit. Her steps didn't just echo, they landed sharp against the marble, like she was walking straight through the noise. The cameras turned toward her without needing a cue. Around her neck, no designer pendant, just a modest gold locket that glinted once, briefly, like a memory held too long. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her presence alone said, "I came to end something." Across the table sat Pete Hegseth, polished, smug, and soaking in the glow of his reputation. A former soldier, Bronze Star on his record war scars, turned talking points. He leaned back slightly as she took her seat, a condescending smirk spreading across his face, like oil slicking the surface of still water. His eyes said, "You're out of your league." But Jasmine didn't flinch. She flipped open her binder without looking at him. And as the chairman called the session to order, she raised her eyes, dead calm, razor sharp, locking onto Pete like a sniper dialing in. What was she holding in that binder that made a war hero look like a man about to be tried for treason? The chairman's gavel struck once, sharp, final. "We now recognize Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett for 5 minutes. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers slid a sheet across the table. White paper, black ink, and a signature box left hauntingly blank. "Mr. Hegseth," she began, voice measured like a blade unsheathed, slowly, "can you explain why a $2.1 billion defense contract funded by taxpayer dollars was executed without a single signature timestamp or traceable order of approval?" The silence hit like a gunshot. Then a chuckle broke through it, low, lazy, and careless. Pete leaned forward, hands folded, eyes gleaming. "Administrative flexibility," he said. "You should look it up. It's how real leaders get things done." The room didn't move. Cameras caught every twitch of his eyebrow, every ounce of arrogance dripping from that phrase. Jasmine didn't blink. "Is that what you call it now?" she replied, lifting another document. "Because this isn't flexibility. This is fraud dressed up in a uniform." Pete shrugged, dismissive. "You're making noise, Crockett. That's what you people do best," yelling from the postal block. And just like that, the temperature dropped. Gas rippled through the gallery. A smirk tugged at the corner of Pete's mouth, satisfied as if he'd finally cut her down to size. But Jasmine didn't react with outrage. She didn't even glance away. Instead, she slowly set the document aside and reached for something else, thicker, sealed, ominous. Her voice dropped half a tone. "You may think I came here to yell, Mr. Hegseth. I came here to document." For a moment, even the red light on the camera seemed to burn hotter, because somewhere inside that sealed envelope was a piece of the truth that could end more than a hearing. Pete Hegseth leaned back, arms crossed, smug smile carved into his face like it had never left. To him, this wasn't a hearing, it was theater. And he'd already cast Jasmine as the loud extra with no script. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She reached for the sealed folder, slowly, deliberately, and laid it on the table like it weighed 1,000 pounds. When she finally looked up, her voice didn't rise, it cut. "That deal wasn't flexible," she said, steady, but with steel in her throat. It was invisible. The words didn't echo, they detonated. The room fell dead silent. Phones stopped. Pens froze midair. For a full breath, the only sound was the hum of the studio lights overhead, like electricity holding its breath. Then gasps. Audible. sharpened by the crack in the image of a so-called patriot who'd always been untouchable. Pete sat up, smile slipping just slightly, as if a cold draft had passed through the room. His fingers tapped the table once then, again nervous now. Jasmine leaned forward, her eyes locked on him, like a scalpel aimed for the softest part of the truth. You call it leadership. She continued, voice rising now, one octave, one beat louder, but all I see is a backroom deal, sealed with a glass and a grin. Her hands stayed still. Her voice did the cutting. Then she dropped it quietly like a final nail. If national security was sold over whiskey, how much of our future did he drink away? There was no answer, just a camera light burning red, and a man who suddenly looked like he couldn't remember what was in his own glass. Pete adjusted his tie, forcing a smile, then leaned into the microphone like a man who still believed the uniform could deflect bullets, especially the kind made of facts. Let me remind the Congresswoman, he began, I've earned not one but 2 Bronze Stars. I bled in uniform while others watched from the sidelines. My record speaks for itself. The words hung heavy, dipped in self-righteousness. A few heads in the gallery nodded. Patriotism has a way of seducing silence. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She let the weight of his medals dangle for a moment, then opened a thin folder labeled Kandahar 2023. Inside, names, dates, faces. Specialist Theo James, Corporal Reggie Santiago, Sergeant Dana Welch. All 3 died when outdated signal jammers failed during an ambush. Her voice didn't tremble. It cracked softly like a quiet funeral under clouded sky. They died in silence because the funding you blocked, because of this $2.1 billion never reached them. Pete shifted suddenly less upright. You can't hang every combat loss on me, he muttered. Jasmine nodded slowly. I'm not hanging it on you. The system failed them. Then she leaned closer, voice lowered to a whisper the room could still hear. But you built the system, and you toasted it in whiskey. The audience didn't know which side to look at, glory or guilt, medals or names. One glimmered under the lights. The other would never speak again. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply lifted a glossy, full-color photograph and slid it under the overhead projector. The screen lit up behind her. Pete Hegseth at Mar-a-Lago suit, rumpled collar, loosened a half-empty glass of bourbon in one hand, leaning in toward Donald Trump, lips inches from the former president's ear. A timestamp glowed in the corner, 9:13 p.m., 2 nights before the deal was logged. The room stiffened like it had just heard a bone snap. She didn't blink. According to 2 eyewitness accounts, both under oath, you gave verbal approval for the $2.1 billion deal at that dinner. 3 drinks in, no counsel, no oversight, just a nod and a toast. Murmurs surged through the chamber like static. Reporters typed furiously. Somewhere in the back row, a congressional aide dropped their pen. Pete shot up, jaw tight. Where were you, he barked, when America needed real soldiers? The words hit the mic like fists. For a second it was war all over again, but in suits and cameras instead of sand and rifles. Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood motionless, hands flat on the table, like she'd been waiting for that exact punch. Buried under budget cuts, she said, calm as steel, and silenced by men who confuse loyalty with obedience. The photo remained on the screen, frozen in time, impossible to deny. A man, a drink, a decision. All that was missing was the signature that cost a nation its truth. The photo still hung in the air like smoke when Jasmine turned the page and calmly slid a new document across the table. Section 19, see paragraph 4, she said, voice precise. Emergency discretion clause. It authorizes verbal instruction, but only in direct combat or national crisis. She paused, letting the words twist slowly around the room. Neither of which includes cocktails at Mar-a-Lago. Cameras zoomed in. Across the aisle, even some Republicans were leaning forward, now reading the clause projected on the monitor behind her. Pete didn't speak. He didn't need to, because at that moment a man in a gray suit from the second row stood up. The room turned. It was Daniel Prentice, one of Hegseth's own senior procurement staffers. His voice cracked but carried. I was instructed to fast-track the contract without logging the standard clearance sequence. I was told, this comes from the top. He set his staff badge on the table and walked out, no notes, no press release, just a man peeling off a mask that had weighed him down for months. Gasps broke from the gallery. Pete's face turned a shade paler, hands clenched under the desk. Jasmine didn't gloat. She simply tilted her head, eyes narrow. So which was it, mister? Hegseth, patriotism, or protection money wrapped in a flag? The flag behind him fluttered slightly under the air vent, but he didn't turn. Because sometimes even the stars and stripes can't cover a wound that deep. The tension hadn't lifted when Jasmine reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small black case, unmarked, sealed with red evidence tape initials, scrawled in permanent marker along the edge. She held it up without a word, letting the weight of its mystery settle across the room. This USB drive, she finally said, was delivered to my office before it reached internal security, straight from someone with Pentagon-level clearance. That's not luck. That's oversight doing what intelligence forgot. The murmurs were instant sharp. Every camera in the chamber zoomed in. Even the aides stopped typing. Pete let out a short, dismissive laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. More stunt work, he sneered, waving a hand. What's next, TikTok court? You gonna dance your way through due process? The sarcasm was thick, but his voice cracked at the edges. He hadn't expected this. Not now. Not live. Jasmine didn't respond. She walked to the tech table, inserted the drive into the system, and stepped back. You can call it a stunt, she said coldly, but I call it evidence. The screen behind her blinked blue, then loaded a single audio file titled Authorization narrate MLG.wav. The room froze. Every eye turned toward the speakers. One breath, two, and then play. There was no more laughter, because what played next wasn't rumor or politics or theory. It was a voice, his, slurred, direct, damning. And suddenly no one remembered the joke. A low static hum crackled through the speakers, then settled into silence before a voice unmistakable and slightly slurred filled the chamber. Trump told me to just sign it. Pete's voice said, thick with bourbon and bravado. He said, I am the paperwork. So I did. The words landed like a detonation. No music, no buildup. Just raw confession stripped of spin. The kind of sentence that makes careers bleed out on the floor. For 2 seconds, no one moved. No chair creaked. No breath dared disturb the room. Then everything happened at once. Phones lit up, journalists scrambled to post, aides whispered frantically into earpieces. A camera zoomed tight on Pete Hegseth's face as the color drained from his cheeks. His eyes darted toward the playback table. Shut it off, he snapped, voice cracking. That's enough. End it. The chairperson didn't blink. Sit down, Mr. Hegseth. You will not interrupt this evidence. The recording continued, laughter in the background, glasses clinking. Pete again. You know how it is. Trump asks, you deliver. I didn't ask questions. That's why he trusts me. The smirk he wore earlier was now gone, melted into a hollow stare. He looked less like a soldier and more like a man watching the roof collapse in slow motion. Jasmine stood still, arms crossed, eyes locked on him, not with vengeance, but with precision. There was no gloating, no speech, just one truth played out loud that the whole nation would hear before nightfall. Pete slammed his palm against the desk, voice shaking more from panic than outrage. This is a violation of committee protocol. He snapped, his words ricocheting through the room like a cornered animal. That audio was manipulated, taken out of context. She's spreading misinformation. This is a political ambush. His eyes darted from the chairman to the cameras, searching for someone, anyone to rescue him. But no one moved. Jasmine stood still, unshaken. She reached into her folder and pulled out a folded sheet, white, plain, and quiet in her hand, but heavier than anything Pete had worn in uniform. This is a sworn whistleblower letter, she said evenly, from a senior official inside the Department of Defense. She opened it slowly, deliberately. He says, and I quote, I participated in a procurement process where authorization was bypassed entirely on verbal command. I did so under duress, and I cannot stay silent while national security is compromised. Pete's jaw clenched. His mouth opened, then shut again, like a man realizing the rope he used to climb up was now tied around his ankles. Jasmine held the page up to the light, letting every camera catch it. Your people sent this, she said coldly. Mine just read it out loud. Then she leaned slightly forward, her voice no louder, but suddenly impossible to ignore. How many voices have to break before silence is no longer patriotic? The room had no answer, only the sound of America watching itself in real time. The room hadn't recovered from the whistleblower's letter when Jasmine reached for one final document, thinner than the other's handwritten edges, soft from being folded and unfolded too many times. She didn't speak at first. She just held it like it was something sacred. Then with her voice low and steady, she began to read. My name is Diane Tucker. My son specialist Daniel Tucker was deployed to Kandahar with Bravo Company. He was 23 years old when his unit was hit by an IED they couldn't detect because the jamming tech they were promised never came. A single breath rippled through the chamber. No charts, no legal jargon, just a mother's grief echoing through marble and microphones. He bled out in the back of a transport truck while they radioed for equipment that should have already been there. Jasmine continued. You tell me, Mr. Hegseth, what medal do I pin on? That her hands didn't shake, but her voice cracked once, only slightly. Enough to remind everyone in that room that patriotism had a price tag and someone else had paid it. The chair turned to Pete. Mr. Hegseth, do you have a response? Silence. His fingers gripped the edge of the table like he was holding on to something that had already slipped away. Mr. Hegseth, the chairman, repeated. Nothing. Jasmine didn't look at him. She just folded the letter back into place gently, like tucking a name into a grave. Because some answers never come, not because they're hard, but because they'd make the lie too loud to ignore. The silence after Diane Tucker's letter still lingered when Jasmine turned to a quote printed boldly on a placard beside her. The optics of diversity weaken combat readiness. It read Pete's own words lifted from a closed-door military policy session 6 months earlier. Jasmine stared at it, then at him. That's not strategy, she said, voice cold as polished steel. That's cowardice dressed in rank. She gestured toward the gallery, and a woman in uniform rolled forward in a wheelchair. Her posture was straight, her gaze unshaken. This is Lieutenant Angela Morris, Jasmine announced. Navy Intelligence. Decorated. Discharged after submitting 3 safety reports that were ignored because she refused to stay quiet. The room turned. Cameras caught the glint of her silver star pinned next to the empty sleeve where her arm used to be. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Jasmine stepped aside and let Angela speak. When I warned command that our encryption tools were vulnerable, I was labeled a diversity risk, she said. 10 days later, my convoy was hit. I lost 3 people. And my arm. Her voice didn't shake. It sliced. Pete looked away, jaw tight, throat visibly tightening. Jasmine returned to the mic. If diversity weakens you, she said slowly, eyes locked on him, maybe your strength was an illusion all along. The room didn't breathe. Even the American flag behind Pete looked suddenly too still, like it knew the pride it once symbolized had just been peeled back layer by brutal layer. Angela Morris didn't wait for permission. She wheeled herself forward with quiet force, every push of her hand steady, deliberate. The gallery parted like a tied, silent reverent, unsure whether they were witnessing a protest or a sacrifice. When she reached the witness table, she stopped, locked eyes with Pete, and unclipped the silver star from her chest. Without a word, she placed it on the polished oak in front of him. The metal landed with a soft, metallic click, but it echoed like a gunshot. You can keep this, she said. It's stained anyway. The gasp was immediate, sharp, collective, involuntary. Pete didn't move. His fingers twitched, but he didn't reach for the metal. His mouth opened slightly, then froze, as if realizing that nothing he could say would weigh more than what had just been laid before him. His face, once smug and untouchable, was pale now, his military armor undone not by policy, but by a soldier he left behind. Jasmine stepped forward not to comfort Angela, but to complete the moment. Her eyes didn't go to Pete. They locked straight into the nearest camera lens, the one broadcasting to every living room in America. This metal weighs less than your lies, she said, voice low, but unshakable, but more than your words ever will. She didn't blink. She didn't smile. And in that breathless stillness, something shifted because for the first time in the hearing, Pete Hegseth looked like a man completely out of uniform. The silver star still sat untouched in front of Pete when Jasmine opened a black folder labeled only with one word, names. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She simply began to read one name after another. Staff Sergeant Caleb O'Neill, Corporal Marcus Tay, Private First Class Elena Ruiz, Lieutenant Jordan Kwan, 38 in total. All fallen within the last year. All victims of failed equipment the $2.1 billion deal was supposed to replace. The room grew colder with each syllable. Each name hit like a bell tolling one after the other. Pete shifted in his chair, then straightened up, clearing his throat with exaggerated frustration. Let's not turn this into a list of tragedies. What this country really needs is to restore order, to bring back discipline in a military that's been corrupted by wokeness and quotas. His words spilled out fast, like a man trying to climb out of his own shadow. But Jasmine didn't look up. She finished the last name, then slowly closed the folder. "Don't you dare," she said, eyes now fixed on him with surgical precision. "Don't bury those soldiers twice, once in the battlefield and again beneath your slogans." Her voice was soft, but the silence that followed made it ring louder than any outburst. Pete looked away, but there was nowhere to look that didn't reflect their names. Because this time the casualties weren't just numbers. They were the cost of his signature and now the weight of her voice. Jasmine didn't give Pete time to recover. Before the murmurs from the casualty list had even died down, she pulled out a fresh stack of papers, highlighted, stamped, and labeled under FOIA release. These, she said, holding them just high enough for every camera to catch, are internal emails between your office and two defense contractors tied directly to the $2.1 billion deal. Her fingers flipped through the first page slowly, then landed on the subject line projected in bold across the screen behind her. "Let's not overthink it," POTUS says, "push it through." The oxygen in the room vanished. Audible gasps, hushed curses, a ripple of chairs adjusting as people leaned in to read every line. Pete stared at the screen like it had turned to fire. The sweat on his forehead caught the light, small but visible, trailing down past his temple as he blinked too often. "This isn't what it looks like," he muttered, voice cracking. These were informal communications, routine briefings, taken out of context. Jasmine didn't flinch. "What context?" she asked. Voice slow and sharp. "Makes it okay for a White House command to replace military protocol?" The screen shifted to another email. "We'll deal with the paper later. Let's not make this hard for the secretary." That line hit harder than any accusation. Pete reached for a glass of water, but knocked it sideways, spilling it across his notes. And in that exact moment, the room stopped wondering if he was guilty and started calculating how long he had left. The email still burned on the screen when a lone microphone lit up across the chamber. It wasn't from Jasmine. It wasn't from the Democrats. It came from Rep. Luis Ramos, a decorated Marine, a centrist Republican, and one of the few in the room whose silence had carried weight until now. He stood slowly, his chest rising with the kind of breath only a soldier takes before breaking ranks. "I served with men who died clean," he said, voice low, rough-edged. "Men who followed orders, trusted command, and never questioned why the gear didn't work until it was too late. This makes my oath feel dirty." No one interrupted, not even the chairman. Ramos looked straight at Pete, not with hatred, but with something far worse, disappointment. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered. "We bled for the uniform, not for its contractors." His voice faded as he sat back down, but the wound had already opened. A Republican had spoken, and the crack in Pete's armor was no longer partisan. It was moral. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't need to. She sat with her hands folded, her eyes forward, her silence louder than a gavel. She let the room feel the shame it had earned. Then finally her voice returned, low, measured, final. "How do you salute a flag?" When it's been wrapped around a check, no one had an answer. Because in that moment, even the flag behind Pete looked too heavy to lift. Just as the chamber began to settle, the monitors flickered with unexpected footage, grainy, raw, pulled from a protest 5 years earlier. Jasmine Crockett stood in the middle of a crowd, bullhorn in hand, chanting beneath city sirens. Behind her, a wall of riot police held their line. The clip was cut short, but the headline had already spread, "Crockett anti-military." It hadn't come from the committee, it had come from Pete's team. Pete leaned into his mic, smug resurfacing, like a man grabbing the last rope on a sinking ship. "So this is who's questioning patriotism," he said, gesturing toward the screen. "Chanting in the street, shouting down the National Guard. That's not leadership, it's chaos in a pantsuit." A few whispers flickered in the gallery, but no one laughed. Jasmine didn't react right away. She waited 3 beats, then leaned in, her voice low but clear. "I wasn't protesting soldiers," she said. "I was protesting the silence that buried them, the silence that let contractors profit while families folded flags." Her eyes never left the screen. And if you think justice is anti-military, maybe you've forgotten who we're supposed to serve. The smear didn't land. It backfired. Because what Pete saw as weakness, the room now recognized as memory. And what was meant to break her had only reminded everyone why she showed up with fire in her voice. The chair recognized the next witnesses, 4 retired veterans, each from a different corner of the country, each carrying scars that didn't fade with time. One by one, they stepped forward and stood behind the same microphone where politicians usually spun truths into fog. But there was no fog now, just fire. A Latino medic who watched friends die from faulty comms. A black infantry sergeant forced to duct tape gear that never arrived. An Asian intel officer left without drones in hostile zones. And a white combat engineer whose entire unit was promised backup. That never came. They didn't bring documents. They brought memory. Real, raw, and uninterrupted. We were told the funding was in motion. One said, fists clenched behind the podium. But nothing came except the body bags. The last to speak was Sergeant Alan Briggs, 28-year Marine, silverbeard, a limp from shrapnel still in his leg. He didn't read. He didn't pause. While we bled, he said, staring at Pete, he drank. The room held its breath. Pete didn't meet his eyes. His gaze dropped to the desk, hands folded too tightly, knuckles white. No spin, no retort, no defense. Just the echo of 4 voices, diverse, united, undeniable. Jasmine didn't speak. She stood behind them, silent as a wall. Because in that moment, truth didn't need amplification. It already had a mic. And the men who carried it had nothing left to lose. As the last veteran stepped down the room, silence gave way to something colder, reality. On the large screen behind the committee-breaking coverage cut in overnight polling numbers. Jasmine Crockett's approval had surged by 19 points. Pete's had cratered. Swing voters, independents, even a chunk of conservative vets. The shift wasn't subtle, it was seismic. Across social media, the hashtags exploded, "Not Your Soldier," leading the charge. Clips of Angela's medal, the USB audio, and Jasmine's stare burned across every feed. TikTok, Twitter, even Fox News couldn't look away. In living rooms across America, people who had never heard her name now said it like she belonged on the ballot. And Pete, once the face of patriotism, was now the man who drank while others died. Jasmine stood again, composed, her voice steady, but cut with the weight of everything that had been said, exposed, and remembered. "You can forge a document," she said, pausing as the room quieted again. "You can forge a signature. You can even forge a career." She turned slightly, locking eyes with Pete just long enough to make it sting. "But you can't forge a death." She stepped back. No grand gesture, no gavel drop. Just that one truth hanging in the air, like a final salute, silent, devastating, and absolutely irreversible. The air inside the chamber turned still, too still. Jasmine reached into her folder one final time and held up a sealed document with a congressional crest gleaming under the lights. Her tone was level, but the words landed like steel. "I am submitting an official request for an Inspector General investigation into Mr. Hegseth's actions, on grounds of procurement fraud, dereliction of duty, and national security breach." No one moved, not the press, not the panel. For the first time, even the red tally light atop the cameras seemed frozen in place. Then from the Republican bench, a voice broke through. "I support the referral," said Rep. Boone, stiff, slow, and visibly conflicted. A second Republican followed, then a third. Pete sat motionless, gripping a pen like it could undo everything unraveling around him. But the ink had dried. Slowly, for the first time in the entire hearing, he lowered his head. No more smirks, no more comebacks. Just a man once decorated, now cornered by truth. Jasmine didn't say another word. She didn't need to. The silence had finally switched sides. Jasmine stepped back to the mic, but this time her voice carried something different. Not fury, not precision, but weight. She didn't speak of politics or protocol. She spoke of people. "This was never about me," she said, eyes scanning the chamber. "It's about every mother who answered a knock at her door. Every widow handed a folded flag. Every child too young to understand why their hero never came home. No one shifted, no one breathed. She let the silence hold them there, anchored in the names they had all tried to forget. They gave their son, she said softly, each word cut clean. And he gave them invoices, delays, excuses, paper trails instead of armor. Her voice didn't rise, but the shame in the room did. Behind her, the image of Specialist Daniel Tucker flickered back on screen. One face, one uniform, one life. Pete didn't look up. He couldn't. Jasmine didn't press further. She'd already said enough. And for the first time, the hearing didn't feel like a courtroom. It felt like a graveyard with too many flags and not enough truth. Jasmine stayed at the mic a moment longer, hands steady, but her breath caught just once enough to crack the armor she'd worn all day. Her voice, until now sharp and unshaken, finally broke. This wasn't about winning, she said barely above a whisper. It was about remembering who we fight for, and who we forget when power becomes more valuable than people. The chamber stayed silent, not out of order, but out of respect. Even the camera zoomed out, as if afraid to intrude on something sacred. The chairman raised the gavel, his hand trembling slightly. One strike. Final. This hearing is adjourned. As the room began to shift, Jasmine didn't move. She looked straight ahead, past the lights, into the truth. Her voice returned one last time, quiet but cutting through everything like glass. If the price of war is truth, are we still willing to pay for silence? In war, lives are sacrificed through blood. But in peace, it's often the truth that's sacrificed first. Silence in the face of wrongdoing isn't loyalty. It's betrayal dressed in quiet. Have you ever stayed silent, not because you agreed, but because you thought your voice wouldn't matter? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes one voice is all it takes to awaken a generation. If this story struck a chord, don't just scroll past it. Like, share, and subscribe to Hill Insights, where silence is challenged and truth stands its ground. Tap the bell, because the next truth revealed might be yours. Which moment in this story stayed with you the most? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters more than ever. This dramatized story is inspired by real struggles and real people. All characters and dialogue are fictionalized for commentary and education. It is not intended to defame or mislead, but to inspire reflection and civic awareness. Thanks for watching. Truth isn't over, it's waiting to be heard.